So in this video on Hatshepsut, we'll be having a look at her family background and her family tree. And this is really important for us to understand because it gives us the basis of some arguments and some judgments that we need to make about how she came to power later on. It's very difficult, it's very complex, but there's a lot of key people we need to understand. But we're going to try and work through it from the latest period and come forward to Hatshepsut and a little bit beyond Hatshepsut, and we'll try and go one step at a time. There are a lot of new names to learn and a lot of relationships to understand, and it's really important that we do understand these relationships very, very clearly. So we could start anywhere really, but we're going to start with a king in the 17th dynasty. So this is in the time period before the reunification of Egypt, which marks the start of the New Kingdom period. It's in what we call the Second Intermediate period, and it's in the time period where we have the Theban kings ruling to the south in Upper Egypt, and we have in Lower Egypt we have the Hyksos ruling. They're still in Egypt, and they're ruling from a place called Avaris in the delta in what's called Lower Egypt. So that's where their capital is. So this is prior to the expulsion of the Hyksos and prior to the reunification of Egypt. And we're starting with Second Enrei-Tao II, who was one of the last kings of the 17th dynasty. Now, Second Enrei-Tao II married Ahotep I. And from those two, that pairing, we see a son, Kamose. And you'll notice here that the colours we're using identify the positions that these people hold. So the blue is indicative of a king with one exception, which we'll get to later on. And the pink indicates the king's principal wife, because the king would often have more than one wife, often had secondary wives who may have been from other royal families or might have been political marriages. But one main wife the idea was they had their one principal wife, which is indicated by the pink, whereas the other secondary wives are indicated by the yellow. So Kamose is the first son of Second Enrei-Tao II and of Ahotep I, and he rules after Second Enrei-Tao II dies. He becomes the new king, and he's the first to really have some major incursions into the Hyksos and to try and expel them. So he attacks Avaris and those sorts of things, and ultimately isn't very successful, and the Hyksos remain in control up in Avaris. However, the next son from Second Enrei-Tao II and Ahotep I, he is far more successful against the Hyksos. He eventually does expel the Hyksos, and he's the king under which we see the reunification of Egypt, which marks the start of the New Kingdom period and the start of the 18th dynasty, which is where Hatshepsut resides. Ahmose also gives his name to the kings for this lineage. So the Ahmosids is how we refer to the kings that are from the lineage of Ahmose. So that's Ahmosids. So Ahmose marries his sister, his full-blood sister, which is quite a common practice in ancient Egypt, and it kept the bloodlines within the family and within the royal family and kept those bloodlines close. So Ahmose marries his full sister Ahmose Nefertari, so from the same family there. And from those two they produce a daughter, Meritamen, and they produce a son, Amenhotep I. So Amenhotep I goes on to become the new king after King Ahmose dies. And again, Meritamen and Amenhotep I, as their parents were, their full-blood brother and sister, and they were married and Meritamen became the king's principal wife, as was the custom during this time period. Moving on from there, we have one child from Meritamen and Amenhotep I, and that child is a female, also called Ahmose. So very easy to confuse all these Ahmoses. So this is the queenly Ahmose, the king's principal wife Ahmose, born from Meritamen and Amenhotep I. Now she didn't have a brother to marry, which is really quite interesting. So she married Thutmose I, and this is where we see the start of a new lineage of kings called the Thutmosids or the Tutmosids, depending on how you pronounce it. So Thutmose I, we're uncertain of his family background, so even though he's not blue, he is most definitely a king. He was a very powerful king and a very successful king in terms of his military and his building programs and those sorts of things, but we don't know of his family background. It's assumed that he was a general, very close to the royal family, and became king because there was a necessity. There was no male heir to continue the throne, so he was given the throne essentially and married into the family and married Ahmose, continuing that lineage. If we continue on, we need to note another little ambiguity or another little thing that we don't quite know about, and that's the actual relationship of Queen Ahmose to her parents and perhaps even her brothers and sisters, because as you can see this line which has a couple of question marks there, because we're not sure about it. We're not sure whether Ahmose is actually the daughter of Meritamen and Amenhotep I, or whether in fact she is the daughter of Ahmose and Ahmose Nefertari, which would make her the sister of Meritamen and Amenhotep I rather than their daughter. So I'll say that again because it is a bit confusing. So Ahmose might actually be the daughter of Ahmose and Ahmose Nefertari rather than the granddaughter. And she might actually be the sister of Meritamen and Amenhotep I rather than their daughter. We're just not 100% sure on where she fits in this record. So Thutmose I wasn't just married to Ahmose, to Queen Ahmose, he also had another secondary wife who wasn't from this royal family. She was from another royal family and her name was Mut-Nefret. And skipping back to that first marriage, Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose, they produce Hatshepsut. So this is where Hatshepsut is from. She's the product of Thutmose I, whose origin we're not 100% sure on, but her mother is Queen Ahmose, who traces her lineage all the way back up to the founders of the 18th dynasty and even further back beyond that. From Thutmose I and the secondary wife Mut-Nefret, we have a son born who is called Thutmose II, and he marries Hatshepsut. Again, as was the custom, as we see further up there with Meritamen and Amenhotep I, with Ahmose and Ahmose Nefertari, and with Second Enrutau II and Ahotep I. So Hatshepsut marries her half-brother in this instance because they only share their father Thutmose I. From there, we have another wife. Okay, so obviously Thutmose II becomes the next king, and Hatshepsut becomes his principal wife, but Thutmose II has another relationship with another woman called Isis. And it's speculated, we're not 100% sure about this relationship. She was either a non-royal wife or she was a concubine. So I've got there that she's a concubine in red with a little C indicating that they weren't actually married, but they had a relationship. A concubine is a woman with whom the king would have relationships but wasn't married to. From Thutmose II and Isis, we have another son born, Thutmose III. So his relationship to Hatshepsut is as both his as a stepson, because she's also married to Thutmose II, and also as a nephew, because her brother is Thutmose II. So I'll say that again. So Hatshepsut's relationship to Thutmose III is both a stepmother. She's Thutmose III's stepmother because she's another wife of Thutmose II, and she's also his aunt because Thutmose II is her brother, okay, her half-brother. So we have kind of dual relationships there between Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, which obviously then makes Thutmose III her nephew and her stepson. Another little relationship here is the progeny of Thutmose II and Hatshepsut, which is Neferure, a daughter. So she's a member of the royal family, she's a daughter, but she doesn't become a principal wife. We also have another marriage here between Thutmose III and not from the same family, Maritre Hatshepsut. So she's from another royal family, but she's a non-royal wife, but she is his principal wife. That should be indicated there. She is a principal wife, but just not of that royal family. And that's wrong. So Thutmose III also had a marriage, another principal wife, and her name was Maritre Hatshepsut. Now, the reason I've given this two different colours is because she is both a principal wife, but she's not actually from this particular royal family. So she should be pink in that she's a principal wife, but she's also not from this actual family. She's not his brother, not his sister, if that makes sense. So Thutmose III has a principal wife, and there's also some speculation, namely from one historian called Gramal, not supported by anything in the historical record, or by any other historians really, that Thutmose III and Neferure were actually married, but we really have nothing to base that on. It's only an assumption made on the fact that most of the other kings and queens of this time period, they married their in the family brother and sister relationships, but it's not really based on anything else. So that's really the lineage of Hatshepsut. We do need to know these people. We do need to know their relationships. I know it's very complex, but it's something we need to understand to be able to articulate our arguments better when we're writing them in responses One thing to note is the heiress theory, which we can talk about, and I'll be doing another video on the heiress theory. But the heiress theory is a suggestion by an historian called Redford that there was a matrilineal succession, so that the power behind the throne, so to speak, came down through the female line. And the suggestion is based on the fact that Thutmose I isn't part of that royal family, whereas Hatshepsut can trace her lineage all the way back through these queens, all the way through to Ahotep I, and then all the way down here to herself, and then obviously to Neferure, her daughter, who has that unbroken line of descent from Ahotep. Whereas if we have a look here, Thutmose I isn't from the royal family. Thutmose II, who does go on to be the king, and his son Thutmose III, who goes on to be the king as well, conjointly with Hatshepsut, they don't actually have any blood relationship with the Ahmosids. So that's the basis of the heiress theory, but we'll talk about that another time.